So I'm going to start by giving you a bit of background as to how I ended up here. So I grew up in country Victoria, farmer, very much a country person, before the internet, so I had no idea about the world out there. And I became a landscape architect when someone saw me constructing a garden and said, "Have you heard of landscape architecture?" So I got into uni and became a landscape architect. And very, very quickly, having grown up in the country in a very low socioeconomic rural area, I very quickly discovered that design was for rich people and that design thinking had the capacity to solve really big issues for a broader population. So I moved to Sri Lanka. I moved to country Sri Lanka in the middle of the war, and I lived there for 2 years. And that's where I first got interested in international development and water and disability. So I worked for a disability organisation in rural Sri Lanka, and I lived in a village where we had wells. A lot of people did their washing in the local waterfalls, and I watched my first powerful example of what happens when you don't listen to local people and you put in improved infrastructure. So the first thing I saw was they brought piped water to my village. Within, I reckon, 60 seconds of the construction workers disappearing around the bends in the road, all the local kids came with their buckets and their bottles and their hammers, and they tapped into those pipes and filled their buckets. And it was joyful because they had water near home. As kids, they didn't have to walk several kilometres to get their water. They just tapped into this new infrastructure. And that was the first time where I went, if they had just asked and spoken to local people, they would have figured out a different response. Because the other thing was, they brought the infrastructure to the area, but they didn't bring it to houses. The other thing that I found out from that was a lot of social capital happens at the well or the waterfall, where the washing happens and the bathing happens and the water collection happens. And when you just go and stick a tap in someone's home, you actually create isolation and do a lot of damage. So that was where I first really got interested in international development and social inclusion. So I worked for a disability organisation, and I really got to understand that there was a whole different world people with disabilities had to navigate. So when I came back to Australia, I worked in local government for 15 years. Now, if you ever want to understand why GEDSI is so important, you just have to work in local government. Because when you get something wrong, you'll hear about it. And you'll hear about it. And you'll hear about it. And you either leave and go to another one, or you then start listening to the community. So I worked in Yarra Ranges Council, where there's 55 townships, multiple natural hazards, really poor infrastructure, and very, very vocal communities. So this recurrent theme of being a landscape architect, the whole way through I kept hearing voices of community members and the knowledge that they had, what they were doing as local people to deal with these extreme natural hazards. Now, I live in Yarra Ranges Council, and we've been kind of victim to multiple natural hazards over the years. So I live this experience as someone who is a resident dealing with these issues and someone who is a designer. And so I get to know my local community and I hear about how these things impact people differently. So once you kind of know that, once you start listening to people, once you start learning about this incredible local knowledge that you don't learn in university, you can't ignore it. And you learn how to really listen. So I got the card that is the Winston Churchill one that says courage is knowing when to sit down and listen. So throughout all that journey, there was one particular group of the population who were listened to less than anybody else and are most adversely impacted by climate changes, and that is children. And in local government, I got to engage with them a lot, and I saw how whenever we engage with children, adults are very quick to squash their voices. So I did my PhD on it through Monash RISE program that Tony Wong, I'm very pleased to see in the room today as one of the leaders of the revitalising informal settlements and their environments. So I looked at mainstreaming children's participation in urban planning processes in vulnerable settings. And the RISE program, I was looking at their involvement in the integrated water management process that was happening in Fiji and Indonesia. And what I discovered was there is a whole other area of expertise that children have that adults don't possess. And so that's an area that I've now include in all of my projects. So when I look at JETSI groups, children are included in that. So what I want to start today is a conversation, because JETSI is now really important in phase 3 for AWP. Now, I said before, equity for JETSI, not equality. And even though we talk about equality, there's a little quote that I constantly think about, and that is, equality is buying everyone a pair of shoes. Equity is making sure they fit. And so if you think about that, it's not about treating everybody the same. It's about understanding their individual experiences, their particular lived experience, and the knowledge that they bring that is going to help you develop a project in a very different way. So I just want to get a sense, if you can hold up out of 5 fingers, with 5 being, you've totally got JETSI completely embedded in everything that you do. And let's not call it JETSI. Let's talk about, women, children, elderly people, people from Indigenous backgrounds, people with disabilities, people with different sexual orientations, different religions, multiple aspects. Who has got that nailed and who is new to it and who is somewhere in between? Just to give me an idea. Okay, great. The whole spectrum. So this is where I'm going to start a room conversation and then take it to the tables. So first of all, who finds it challenging, and what's the challenge that you have with it? And this is it could be it costs too much, or I don't know enough about it. There are a few ones in here. Is it something that you're new to, don't know how to do? Your projects are not relevant? And this is where I'm going to have fun. I think I saw one.
You picked me out because I've got silver hair. Yeah, you're right. So we're a small engineering organisation, and in fact we had a similar discussion about it before. We're just starting out because we're heavily involved in water treatment. The folks that we are currently employing and looking at have something like 30 years of sort of tribal knowledge around water treatment, and so unfortunately the cohort of people are people like me. So we certainly are at the infancy stage of where we need to be, and we acknowledge that, and but we're struggling to kind of how to move forward. What's the next step? How do we make sure that it becomes more inclusive, and we still have the outcomes for our customer that so that's for us a challenge.
So Lino from Plexus, thank you. That's a really interesting point that you brought up, that everyone looks like you. So I was recently in Nepal running Jitsi workshops, but I said to my team, I'm not going to get up in front of everyone in these workshops looking like me, a person from a country that's not Nepal, when I don't know a lot about the culture, and I'm working with people, some of whom are very disadvantaged. It needs to be in their language. It needs to be with someone that they can relate to and understand, that they're not trying to battle my Aussie accent, which always seems to be very difficult to understand. And so the local team led it, and sitting in that room, it was very apparent very quickly that that was the right way to go. It was running local languages, and it was run by people that they could connect to and trusted. So I think trust is one of those big issues that comes in when you start including different groups. If you've got a place that you're working in where there are very patriarchal, rigid social rules, you can't just have a man go into a room full of women and engage and think that will work. One of the exercises that were just running in Nepal, we couldn't get any young women. And the feeling was that they were not going to be given permission to participate because it was in a public area. So these are some of the considerations. So I'm going to ask a different question. Who's really passionate about it? Carly, tell us a story.
I'll put my water aid hat on as chair of water aid and speak to the change in water aid over the years, from being a pipe and pipe supplier into communities to put the water in, to looking at system strengthening within the community and where that starts from in the community. It starts from talking with the community, which generally starts with the men, and there it can move if you're actually very sensitive to how Jitsi elements can be introduced into culturally sensitive environments. You can start to talk to women, and then through talking to women, you can then get to different age groups, and from the different age groups, you can get to the disadvantaged in the community, to the disabled, and start to have the conversations that actually bring everyone's voice to the table. But then help you to co-design system by which that infrastructure can operate. So Water Aid have really focused on that in a big way over the last, 10 years, decades, maybe longer than that, in changing the way they think about infrastructure. It's actually not about infrastructure. Everyone knows how to build pipes and pumps and get water. What people don't know how to do is to connect the people and to create something with those people that's going to be sustainable in the longer term. And Jitsi is the key to that. If you're not investing in Jitsi, you're leaving most of the community out of the decision making.
Yeah, great. I loved, you said systems. Everyone knows pumps and pipes and things like that, but systems, training.
Thank you. I just wanted to reflect on what is now perhaps 10 years of experience working in really impoverished communities, poor and vulnerable. And in the struggle I have in a lot of this work in terms of trying to make Jitsi a mainstream in an outcome. And there's no question about embedding Jitsi processes into our co-design and so on. But if we are true to the values of co-design, the outcomes often reflect the cultural values of the community that we work with, which does not necessarily align with our view of what Jitsi outcomes ought to be. And of course, when you're working, as I am, in those situations where the budget is tight, it in the end is all about community-driven prioritization of actions. And I think that the inclusion gender, quite often that gets through very easily, to make sure that the notion, for instance, and the work we do to ensure that we avoid communal toilets as much as we can to provide a level of safety and protection to women. as we get really down, or as we get up in terms of the hierarchy of different levels of inclusion, it gets harder and harder. Disability gets really hard in some sense. So on the one hand, we can include the aspirations in the processes of GETSI into our discussion and co-design. I'm often conflicted by observing how the local culture and values are driving the solution. That is, to some degree, counter to some of our aspirations. And so you're constantly faced with that challenge of how do you actually get the kind of outcomes we would like to see, but how do you avoid what might be a very colonial way of trying to foster the type of international development by being very true to the spirit and the principles of co-design and self-determination. So I constantly struggle with that. I constantly feel like the projects that I'm involved with fail to reach the type of aspirations that we have. But at the same time, there are also biophysical fundamentals that we needed to achieve in a lot of the areas that I work in, which is largely sort of informal settlement, rehabilitation, improving the health of the community by reducing the exposure to fecal contamination and stuff like that.
Thanks, Tony. There's a lot to unpack there, which I'll get back to, but I just wanted to ask, because the program that you're working in is so participatory and inclusive, have there been any really unexpected outcomes where you've involved the community, you had that idea, they've come up with this, and it's been implemented, and you've gone, wow, we would never have come up with that, and that's impacted this? Be on the spot a bit, but I know you have stories.
There are a lot of very positive unintended outcomes that we would not have anticipated. But in the way we deliver co-design, we want to make sure that it is couched with a level of technical rigor. And often, communities and even local practitioners may not see. The type of vulnerability that many of our communities face is all too subtle. And it's something that just creeps up. So often, even in our co-design, we have, if you like, first developed a bit of an envelope of possible solutions and actually raising first the awareness of the community to the type of vulnerability they face. But what is really an unintended consequence of the engagement in co-design really is the progressive building of collective advocacy within the community, which is sort of really unintended in the sense that, to put it very simply, it's almost like with the type of work that we do, we have actually inadvertently created a really strong sense of community, whereby collectively they actually understand their vulnerability and they understand equity. That they understand that not everybody actually needs to have the kind of toilets that we're delivering. But if those that are having toilets are actually going to improve the environmental exposure of the whole community, then everybody benefits. So they again understand what is actually a very complex concept of equity. It's so much easier to deliver equality, and that's how we started. Something is, if my neighbor's going to have a toilet, I'm going to have a new toilet as well. Or we had to then explain, well, if you look at the conditions of the toilets and safety and all. So that was it. And what we're seeing is that the collective advocacy have led to significant community empowerment, whereby they are now actually actively wanting to work with government to actually deliver a whole range of other benefits. And that, for me, is quite enlightening in terms of how the process of co-design have led to that, led to their increased awareness of their exposure, and through that their sense of self-determination and collective advocacy, as I mentioned. But nevertheless, I have often been disappointed how by letting go and letting the community drive it, then you find that some of those really great cultural values of patriarchy society do sort of permeate through some of the choices that they make.
So I'll just cover off on another two things that have come out of these discussions, and then I'm going to hand it over to the tables for a bit of a discussion. The first one is systems, and that's systems thinking that we often go in with we have a problem to fix, and it's to do with water, and it's going to involve some pipes and things. And then when you involve the community, you actually find out that we know about that. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, these are the things that really need attention. So we've heard about community advocacy and systems. Again, there's a...
Have you heard NRB here? What do you say in relation to the dilemma that
excellent. That's good. So the water pollution project that we've been looking at in Nepal, all of our questions, all of our tours along the river, our co-design workshops, the focus was water pollution. And what we repeatedly got back was, yep, we know that's an issue. We know why it's an issue. We know what needs to be done, but you need to look at it in the context of all these other things. You need to look at it in the context that we have given up our spiritual heart because the river is very spiritual to us and we've turned our back on it. So we need to look at it again. But we also consistently heard that this is a place of respite and recreation, and that the broader urban planning of Kathmandu doesn't allow for lots of green open spaces, and it doesn't allow for waste management. And they were the issues of focus. And we tried to bring them back to water pollution. We're like, no, it's part of a bigger system. So that's the first thing. But the other thing is about doing no harm. So in a lot of places that we're working in cultures that are very different to what we're used to, what we've been brought up in, how we think. And so it can be really challenging to go and work in a highly participatory situation where your own values are being challenged, tested. And you've got to work out, where is the line? Where do I push? But where do I actually need to accept that that's a line I can't cross? I can't judge it. There's no right or wrong here. It may challenge me deeply. It doesn't mean that I'm right. It just means that there is a very different way of living here. And if I upset one thing too much, what sort of harm is that going to cause? So that's another really tricky thing with Jedzi, because if you start exposing people, so we ended up meeting accidentally. Miha and I met with the big national lesbian group when we were in Kathmandu, who had a convention at the centre where we were running the workshops. Now, we tried to engage them, but they were really concerned that they would be exposed to people who would not accept them. But they were happy to talk to us in their space where they felt safe. So what I want you to do now is MC. How much time can I give everyone for a table chat?
Well, what's my time right there for you?
Okay, so let's do 15-minute chats on tables and then 15-minute chats as a group. And as a table, I want you to pick a topic, something that we've discussed, that people brought up, or something that hasn't been discussed yet that you really want to discuss, or draw on other people's experience or their ideas, or just say, I don't know how to do this, I don't want to do this, help me work my way through that. Whatever it needs to be. Sounds like there needs to be some table merging. So feel free to move tables and start chatting. As part of my PhD study, I discovered that when you involve people in the work that you're doing, the younger they are, it actually impacts their career choices. It impacts their desire to stay in school. It gets them seeing themselves as something else, particularly if you have a really diverse team in the field. I found this with the RISE program at Monash, where when you had male and female scientists in the field, you had young girls gravitating towards female scientists, young boys gravitating towards the male scientists, and asking lots of questions and saying things like, could I do that? And I found that consistently. I looked in refugee camps, 4 refugee camps across the world, interviewed people, the RISE program in Fiji and Indonesia and informal settlements, and post-disaster reconstruction in Australia and Ecuador. And it was consistent. When young people are involved, they start to think about who they could be later on in life. And I think equally true is when you put young people, like young engineers, in the field, that's going to create a two-way sort of learning experience where those young people are exposed to a very, very different way of doing things. I also heard another good point was over here about you're not going to shift everything, but you're going to shift the dial. Someone else, Jetsy is not a separate box. It's a part of the way that you think in how you deliver your projects. But I'm going to hand over to this table down here, 2 minutes, because we have a Star Trek approach down here that I would like Sona to share with the group. In 2 minutes or less, tell us about your Star Trek approach.
Gee, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. All I said, in my defence, and being a sci-fi geek and a nerd, was ultimately that it is the Star Trek approach. I do no harm. You're there to observe and to not judge the culture that you're actually looking at, but to just observe it. You shouldn't actually be participating. You shouldn't actually be trying to push it into what your ideas might be of what is correct or acceptable behaviour or how to operate, because it's not your culture. The only thing you should be doing is looking to achieve a better material outcome for that community or for that group that would have been the case if you weren't actually there on the ground. So for me, you're there to facilitate and bring whatever knowledge you might have that is capable of helping that community or that society, and letting them work out how it is that they want to operate.
Thank you. You also noted that it should be outcomes focused, and I like that. It's very easy to get caught up in the inputs and the outputs, but what we're trying to achieve here is outcomes for communities with them. This table, anything?
Well, we had lots of conversations, but I think at the end there was a moment about information and comms. And so if you build on the Star Trek, we kind of got to Star Trek in our own way, and then we realised that nothing may not happen, and millions of dollars may be spent, and they still decide that putting cow poo in the river is how you attract fish. You feed the fish, and you can't change their minds on that, but perhaps then that the output wasn't what you went in for, which was some big development. It was about informing, providing information and comms.
It's a great question, and I think that's where I spoke with one table where acronyms can be really dehumanising, and we're particularly seeing that coming out of the US with this discussion about DEI. It's very easy to say you're anti-DEI If you actually get people to talk about what that means, you're asking them to expose themselves as being anti-human in a way, that they're only interested in their own interests. And so how we talk about GEDSI, for want of a better term, it's a term I generally tend to avoid using because it does dehumanise. I think Saturday's election here, I think we have a bit of hope. I think it could have gone very, very differently. But I don't think that's a reason to not do it. I think it's a way of we just start talking about it differently. So even though we might have support, we talk about it differently rather than just, we'll do a GEDSI component. We're actually going to include local people's knowledge and we're going to understand local people's lived experiences so that that can help shape the outcomes and the outputs that we deliver. It's a different conversation. This table here.
We talked about shifting the dial. And I think one of the things that, from the conversations that you said, I think that's really important, and some of my experiences is you walk into a room where you're doing government to government work and you do get confronted by a room full of men and women here, if there are any women in the room at all. But you can shift the dial really easy by asking questions you know the men aren't home to answer them in a really curious way. So do you have an elderly mother? Yes, I have an elderly mother. Most men sitting in the room are elderly and don't have an elderly mother or know someone who has. How do you think they would cope in that environment? You know, if you thought about what their needs might be. You might ask, do you have anyone in your family with a disability? Now, most people have someone in their family that has, or know of someone who has a family member with a disability. You ask the question, how do you think they might be able to deal with that kind of infrastructure? Then the next meeting you won't have, disability of women and all that, but you will have more diverse people brought into the room just in case you ask that difficult question again that they can't answer. And that is shifting the dial in their thinking. And once you've shifted the dial in their thinking, then you start to actually move the dial. It doesn't happen that quickly, but that is how you can, using curiosity in the questions and relating it to their context and their understanding of what their family environments might be or what their community environments might be and how those problems might be brought to the table in the discussion. So it's about ensuring that at every opportunity you ask the question about other people that aren't in the room.
It's a great point. It's something that we did the other week in Nepal where we did a put yourself into the shoes of somebody else. And not only was it really difficult, so we constructed these characters, young women with a disability living in informal settlement and so on. Not only was it very difficult, but it was difficult for people to actually step outside their daily profession and think about themselves as a community member. And that's something we forget. I've certainly had plenty of experience as a community member where suddenly we've had a whole heap of new infrastructure inflicted upon us in a way that is unsuitable for the environment and unsuitable for our local conditions. And in that moment, I'm a local community member. I'm not a technical expert because it's impacting on how I live. But we forget that. And it was incredible to watch how difficult it was for people to step outside their technical role into being a community member who was very different to themselves. But it's a great exercise, and asking those questions really does make people stop and think about what something might be like for someone else. Sarah?
I just wanted to underline something that you just said, problem, which is that it's difficult. I think we should all recognise that asking the questions is difficult. I have to put this out there a little bit. It's uncomfortable. It requires drawing attention to some proud angst in the room, which is not always easy to do as an outsider. So just recognise it's not going to be easy. If it feels easy, we'll not crying in the microphone. And just the other thing I want to say is that we always have to come into these conversations with humility, right? So coming from Australia, we're into right. We still got big issues here in this country as well. It's all a learning conversation. That's it for me. Our partnership approach is we're learning each other. So everybody's on a pathway. Everybody's trying to change style, do better stuff. Not coming with all the answers.
So as a young-ish engineer, one of the comments which I see floating around is, if you're just a consultant, you don't have the experience of what it really takes to solve the problems on the ground. Okay, that's fine. But what opportunities are there? Like, a lot of the time, you don't get the opportunity to work hands-on with the system. And at our table, Lino was actually talking about a challenge that he has in his company where they'll go to commission a project overseas, and that handover phase is a challenge to the local community. But potentially, there's an opportunity for young engineers is to, when you're coming out, it's a challenge also technically because there's not all that experience there, but to get that generation coming through with hands-on experience, working with the system, working with people, if that can work well, then you set up this person to have a much broader understanding of what it takes to make a project successful in a completely different country, all the other soft skills which come with it. So we're trying to move the industry forward. That's the new generation which we're setting up to do that. So.
And you're also bringing in a different sort of expertise, which is fresh eyes, fresh thinking, access to new research. So, you can't underestimate the power of a young person coming in who might not have those technical skills, but they've got completely different skills that add to the mix. And I think the diversity of teams can really be quite powerful for that very reason, because you're all bringing in something. And there's a bit of pressure when you're a technical expert to be all things to everyone. And you're not. Do the stuff you're good at and bring in other people who are good at the other stuff. And then you've got a more diverse team, and you're going to get more interesting results that are going to impact more positively. Great, thank you. I will wrap up with a couple more comments, and please keep chatting to each other about this. They're really great comments. First one is, if you're running consultation with local people and you end up with a shopping list, then you've done it wrong. So there's not a lot of right and wrongs, but there's wrong when you do harm and there's wrong when you get a shopping list, because it means you haven't really understood the lived experience of people. You haven't really understood how you can work together with the local people to get good outcomes. And a great way of thinking of it is, if you consult with children on a playground and you get a swing, a slide, and a list of those things, you haven't engaged with children. You haven't asked them about what do they love, what makes them happy, what do they do when they play, what do they do when they need quiet time, that sort of thing. It's the same with communities. It's not about generating a shopping list. The comment over here about having a JETSI specialist, it is really important, because they're the ones who can help you understand what might be harmful, what might not be. They can do the research on what is the community that you're working in, who is there, what are the dynamics, what do you need to steer away from, how do you approach this situation. That's really important. But what's most important is that everyone in the team is going in with the right mindset. And instead of thinking of it like JETSI, the reason why I've kind of gone down this path with all the integrated water management that I've done and all the wild, crazy water projects I've done all over the world, they're exciting when you talk to local people. It's so interesting. When you find out, what do you know? What have you developed? What's the knowledge that your community has developed over the last 100, 500, 2,000 years? How can we scale that up? What does your life look like on a daily basis? It's really interesting, and it helps crack open some of those stock standard responses that we make that is not necessarily going to solve a problem. You end up with something far more creative. So it's an exciting thing. It's not a chore when you start thinking about the really exciting powerful knowledge that you can help harness and bring together for an outcome that's actually going to have lasting impact on those communities. So I'm just going to leave it there. Please keep talking about it, sharing your ideas. There's incredible experience in the room. Anyone who's new to it, ask people over lunch.